and I would like to welcome all of you this morning to our talk on the current international economic crisis. The sponsors of today's session are Against the Current and the Bulletin in Defense of Marxism. Both of those periodicals can be found down in the literature area, and anyone who's interested in knowing the background of the people that put those materials together can spend lots of time down in that area talking to people. I don't want to spend our time right now discussing that. Our first speaker today is Anwar Shaikh. Anwar Shaikh is a professor of political economy at the New School for Social Research and also an editorial associate of Against the Current. Anwar's work has been a critical contribution to the extension and refinement of Marxian classical political economy on the theories of crisis and growth. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anwar Shaikh.
Thank you. Can you hear me without the mic? Is that all right? Okay. I wanted to talk about some of the patterns of the capitalist world economy. I realize that in the present state of the world, that's a kind of old-fashioned topic because all the attention seems to be shifted away. And I'd like to tie it in to what is happening in Eastern Europe, because the question is, really a fundamental question is, what are the basic structural patterns of the capitalist economy, of capitalist systems? How are they expressed in the advanced capitalist countries? We know to some extent how poorly the system functions in the third world, but that obviously has implications for countries trying to switch over to capitalism. Let me begin by reminding you that if you look at virtually any part of the world in the 1980s and 1990s, you see a pattern of increasing economic and financial instability. And that economic and financial instability is then transmitted or reflected in political instability. One doesn't have to even document this for the third world with its huge debt, its crushing economic problems, massive poverty and unemployment mired in that for decades with little or no way out, now turning in many cases desperately to the market as a kind of solution, a fictitious solution to their problems. I want to focus instead on the advanced capitalist countries. And I'm going to particularly focus on the United States because the United States, in spite of its slippage in the world economy, is still the central capitalist power. And even if you think of it as nothing more than a kind of statistical sample of the capitalist world economy, it occupies a large space in that world economy. We know that in the last few years there's increasing concern, even among the most positive proponents of capitalism, increasing concern about economic and financial instability. It is now not even a secret on Wall Street that the years of the 80s all over the world were years in which the world economy was pumped up through credit. If any of you had to suffer through economic textbooks, then you know that most economic textbooks, at least the liberal Keynesian textbooks, argue that credit really has no particular cost to the economy as a whole, because what you get from one side, what you pump in on one side, you have to take out and pay for in interest, but it is simply a transfer from one group of people to another. I'm not going to argue that. I'm going to argue just the opposite, that there are major and systematic costs to the issue of credit, to the extension of credit. And we see this in the gyrations of the stock market. We see this in the increasing rate of business failures, in the problems in the insurance industry in the United States, in major banks, the decline of the real estate market all over the world, and the decline in real wages and employment in many, if not most, parts of the advanced capitalist world. This problem of general patterns requires something more than a kind of a technique of averaging. It doesn't do us any good to say, well, it's general. We need to know whether this generality is an accident or whether it is, in some sense, a structural pattern. Now, I've already given the game away by saying that it is a structural pattern, and it's expressed naturally with different rhythms and different timings in different capitalist countries. But I believe that it is a very fundamental pattern that has occurred in the past, including the economic situation which preceded the 1929 crash. The crash itself was a kind of visible, most acute marker of the problems. But the period in the 20s and perhaps even earlier already signaled the stagnation of the world economy. And if we could get data for these kinds of things going back to the 1860s and 1870s on profitability and at a world level, I believe one would find a similar pattern there. Many people have written about this, the most prominent of whom is Ernest Mandel, who's written about long waves and about the structural patterns, and I will not dare to sort of repeat what he's already said. He's here and he will be able to speak about these issues. I want to focus on the present period, and I want to try and show you in some concrete detail how this structural pattern unfolds for the United States. It is important because we are here and it materially affects our lives, but it is also important because it is a representative pattern for the, I believe, for the overall world economy. Everybody, I think, knows by now that the Japanese economy is no longer this invulnerable monolith which it had been portrayed before, that the stock market, for instance, in Japan has been declining for the last 2 years. In nominal terms alone, has fallen 50%. And that is an astonishing unraveling of the credit structure. Japan's economy has been heavily dependent on credit. The real estate market in Japan, which has been unraveling prior to the stock market unraveling, and is intimately connected to the stock market unraveling, has been so inflated that the land prices in Japan have risen to levels certainly never seen before in human history, but never seen in any other country of the world. It has been widely cited that the land value around a certain region close to around Tokyo is greater than the whole land value of the United States. That is quite an astonishing statistic. It's some indication of the extent to which the Japanese real estate market has been pumped up. Well, that pump is no longer working. If I may mix my metaphors wildly, the air is leaking out, and it has been deflating for some time in spite of every attempt to keep it up. I'm going to get back to that with some data which is kind of striking. Well, all of this is about, as I said, an old-fashioned topic, which is what are the structural patterns of capitalism? Because all fashionable people now turn their eyes towards the restoration of capitalism in what used to be called the Soviet bloc, certainly in Eastern Europe and also in the Third World. And many people have concluded that there's really no alternative to capitalism. I don't believe that's true, and I think that the fact that we are dispirited, and rightly so, about the sort of general collapse of these alternatives does not mean that capitalism will function better simply because we now believe it will. It has its own rhythm, and it has its own way of coming to its critical moments. And I think that in whether we wish to see it or not, capitalism will put on the agenda the question of alternatives to capitalism. Its functioning and its patterns and its malfunctioning will bring these items back to the agenda. But I say this with some caution because the alternatives to capitalism are not always outside of capitalism. The alternative to current forms of capitalism can well be more restrictive and more brutal forms of it. In any case, to jump to the question of the present, the present period, in my opinion, has many significant parallels with the 1920s. The instability in the world economy, the pileup of debt, worldwide economic and political turmoil, even already a great stock market crash, at least one that we know of in 1987, and a very rapid deflation in Japan, which is in all effects a stock market crash, as everybody in Japan knows. The stock market crash in 87, for instance, was a drop of about 22% in a space of a day or two. Roughly $1 trillion in financial assets was wiped out in a single day in the world market. And that was 60% more than the whole third world debt. Yet the market bounced back, and I'll show you in a minute how extensively it bounced back, within a few days, and recovered essentially its levels within months, if not years. The stock market crash did not trigger an economic crash, and that raises a very important point which I want to make, is that one must not associate the idea of the structural problems of persistent economic crises with the idea of a off-the-cliff collapse. There are historically in capitalism more than one form of crisis. We find in the earlier periods, such as the 1870s, a long drawn-out period of stagnation with instability in eventual recovery. We find in the 20s a period of stagnation and instability, but that sharp marker of a financial collapse. So those two patterns can be found in other periods also, and we have to keep in mind that the pattern as well as the recovery itself are things which are more concretely determined. What is striking to me is the old argument in Marx that, in fact, this, even though the pattern and the recovery are historically and conjuncturally determined, the movement from a period of boom to a period of crisis is something built into the very nature of the reproduction of the system. And I don't want to talk about this at an abstract level alone, so I'm going to present some data about this pattern, but I want to just remind you about the basic story, so to speak, in Marx, which is presented in a very fragmentary way in Capital, and more or less was lost to the Marxist tradition, or at least is a minor position. I've been a minority all my life. I seem to seek it out even when it's not otherwise necessary. So even in this context, I'm holding a minority position. The argument is well known, at least in name, which is the idea of a falling rate of profit, a rate of profit which falls because accumulation itself lowers the rate of profit and undermines it. And there are certain elements to the argument. I want to just briefly mention them. The principal thing that drives the falling rate of profit in Marx is the idea that the capital intensity of production, the amount of capital tied up per worker or tied up per unit output, rises. And if that is true, then it can be shown that that inevitably will lead to a profit rate which will fall.
So you're a minority of two.
A minority of two, yes. I didn't say one. No. Well, this fall in the rate of profit undermines the growth in the mass of profit. Well, that's quite reasonable, because the mass of profit grows when you accumulate, but it declines when the rate of profit falls. So those two factors work against each other. And if it were just left at that, then the one or two could dominate. But in fact, the accumulation of capital, the growth factor in the mass of profit, depends on the rate of profit, so that the growth factor itself is undermined by the falling rate of profit, relatively weakened. And from this one can argue quite formally and systematically that the net effect is a stagnating mass of profit. I've been doing a lot of work recently on what is called macrodynamics, nonlinear representations of the accumulation of capital, because those are formal tools which are very handy. And one can show even in there that when this mass of profit stagnates, the system changes behavior. It becomes literally, mathematically, so to speak, unstable, but politically and economically unstable. And that this instability then is a series of pattern changes which show up in a variety of ways, naturally, because they're more concretely determined, more conjuncturally determined, but they are produced systematically. So let me try and show you, I think I have about 10 or 12 minutes, the pattern for the United States itself. I anticipate, oh, well, 15 minutes. Well, that's great. So I can talk about Japan then. One of the predictions in this argument in Marx, which was developed by Grossman and others, but largely was lost to the tradition. Rosa Luxemburg rejects it out of hand, as does Lenin, and in fact the dominant tradition has more or less rejected it. We are a minority here, definitely, but not as small as we used to be as a minority. The first is the famous organic composition of capital. This is data from the United States Economic Report of the President and the Survey of Current Business. The only thing which is not conventional is my own measure of capacity utilization, and if there are economists I can talk about that, but I've written about that and published the data and the techniques in ERPI and in a pamphlet put out by Against the Current. So this is the data of the stock of capital relative to the wages of production workers. It's the money equivalent of what Marx calls the value composition of capital. And you can see that everything is indexed numbers, so that in the beginning it's 100%, so we can judge the relative rise, because that's the question. You can see that it starts off at 1 and rises at 100% by construction and rises to over 2. So it's 100% rise in the value composition of capital in the United States over the post-war period, 1947 to 1989, 1990. All my data goes up to 89, 90, which is the last sort of systematic update I could make. The crucial similar and associated ratio is the ratio of capital to net output, which again adjusted for capacity utilization, and that rises by about 40% at its peak here, and then has come down a bit. The movements of that are cyclical still, but the overall trend is very clear and substantial. The second argument in Marx, which is crucially related to this, is the anticipation that productivity will rise faster than real wages, i.e. the rate of exploitation, the rate of surplus value will rise. So here we have productivity, which is the orange curve, and the real wage of production workers, which is the green curve. And you note that they spread apart, and this is standard data, BLS, Economic Report of the President, Survey of Current Business. You notice that they spread apart, indicating that even in the period of normal boom accumulation, the rate of productivity grows faster than real wages. What is even striking, more striking, is how great the gap is since the economy began to stagnate in the 70s. And that not only have real wages now grown more slowly than productivity, they've actually declined absolutely and for production workers. And many families have had to make it up by having more than one worker. We have 2 people working in the family, working extra jobs, but the actual rate of pay in real terms has declined. Well, this third graph is the punchline, the synthesis of all those previous tendencies, the rising rate of surplus value, but the rising value composition of capital. It is the rate of profit, of corporate rate of profit in the United States, adjusted for capacity utilization, beginning in 1947 and ending in 1989. Now, I don't think it's hard, I don't need to stress that it has fallen a lot. Capitalists will tell you this, and in this context, at least, some of us are on the same side as business in terms of its actual statements as opposed to its prescriptions. It falls from about a high of 14% to the present level of about 6%, which is an enormous drop in terms of profitability. Moving on rapidly. One of the anticipations of the theory is that the mass of profit will rise at a slower rate, and at some point it'll switch over to an essentially stagnant tendency. And that, you can see here, this is the mass of profit in blue, and you can see that in up to about 1967, which is the dividing line, the mass of profit rises, and then it switches over to essentially stagnant level. And notice the difference in the patterns. In the first case, you have a strong growth pattern, and you can see that the mass of profit has a very strong upward trend. This pink line is the real stock market index, the New York Stock Exchange index, and you can see how strongly it rises until about the 1967-68 period. Now look at the difference in the pattern in the second half. Stagnation here for the mass of profit, but also very rapid and violent oscillations. That's a hallmark of structural instability. Notice the stock market decline up here, at bottom in 82, a rise till 87, and now a kind of, again, hesitation, but it's only basically reaching back the levels of 1967. And as you'll see in a minute, that pattern is even more striking in Japan. This is the real wage of production workers, and I wanted to show the different patterns. You see the real wage rising in the first half of this period, sharply and upward, and the unemployment rate stagnant and relatively stable. Now look at the pattern in the second half of the period. The real wage peaks in the 70s and then declines. The unemployment rate rises and is more unstable. This graph here is of the rate of accumulation, the growth rate of real capital stock, and you can see that it has lots of oscillations because it's a growth rate, but you can see its strong upward trend in the first half of this period, in the post-war period. Now look at its pattern in the second half. Notice the characteristic oscillations and the general downward tendency of the rate of it. It's a very crucial rate. Obviously, capitalists care a great deal about this, but it's also the rate that determines, in some sense, the fundamental viability of the system. This is the real federal budget deficit. The blue is a surplus. The orange is a deficit. Up to 1967, you can see the pattern of slight movement toward budget deficit, especially because of the Vietnam War, but the pattern afterwards is structurally very different. Now, that difference is true in many advanced capitalist countries, in fact, in most advanced capitalist countries. I don't need to remind you, of course, that Reagan and Bush are probably the biggest deficit spenders in the history of the universe, probably. at least of the world. At least of the world. In the process, I lost a couple of key graphs, and so I have to recover those. Excuse me a second. One more graph, which is profit rates in other advanced capitalist countries. This is from 64 to 89, 88, because the data is not always available on a systematic basis. This is from the OECD in yearbook. Japan. Germany is the green one. The US, this is manufacturing profit rates, is the blue one. France, the light blue. Sweden, the pink. I use pink for Sweden for obvious reasons. And the UK, the black one. Now, of course, there are different patterns and different conjunctural factors. There are important issues such as the discovery of oil and the use of credit. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one other thing. You will note that in almost all of these countries, there's a kind of recovery in the 80s. And that recovery can be tied back to the cutback of social programs, the decline in real wages, an increase of unemployment, basically recovery mechanisms which are built into the system. They are not accidental. You'll see that sharply in the US, the blue line recovers, and you can also see it in the UK, the sharp rise. Not an accident at all. And the last one is the Japanese stock market. This is from 1987 to 1992, and you can see the stock market rising until about 1990, and then it has declined down to 50% roughly, well, yes, 50% of its level since its peak in 1990. Many people are extremely frightened about this phenomenon because it seems improbable that it will not, so to speak, infect the rest of the system. Okay, so I want to emphasize from this that this argument does not imply that, that we have to put up, so to speak, with the consequences of a crisis. The argument is specifically that the system has structural forces, momentum, which produces these patterns and brings us to the crisis, and therefore raises the issue about the viability of the system itself. The recovery from a crisis requires certain things which we do not have to, so to speak, accept. It is not natural that or automatic or inevitable that the system will always recover, that wages will have to be cut back, that many people will have to be unemployed. These are political questions, questions which we are forced to face, so to speak, by the system itself. And this is most evident, not so much in the advanced capitalist world, but in the third world, where this crisis came much earlier, where it is much deeper, and where huge numbers of people suffer to the extent of dying from these consequences of this system. And so any discussion about the great virtues of capitalism in Eastern Europe or in Peru or so on should keep in mind what it is that capitalism actually does. Thank you.
We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. I'd like to introduce our second speaker now. He needs very little introduction, except to say that many people consider Ernest Mandel the foremost Marxist political economist in the world today. He is an editorial associate, as are myself and Anwar, of Against the Current. He's also an editorial associate of Bulletins for the Defense of Marxism, and he is also a member and leader of the Fourth International.
Thank you. Dear friends and comrades, my remarks will be a complement, a supplement to what Anwar has said, because there are no differences amongst us, and I want to say just in passing that I consider Anwar the best Marxist economist today in the world. I will
You
start.
shouldn't say that because I'll be unemployed tomorrow.
Unfortunately, that's how things are in this nice world of ours.
Do you want the mic?
We start from the assumption that a long depressive wave of capitalist development began the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, and that, as all long depressive waves, it has a certain number of general characteristics to which we will then add some specific characteristics. General characteristics are a significant decline of the rate of growth of output in the most general sense of the word, that average of output in the capitalist world since the beginning of this depressive long wave is less than half of what it was in the previous period of expansive long wave, a constant buildup of unemployment, even in periods of recovery. I would say roughly, although the data are in dispute, if you take the real figures, not the official government figures, which are fake, even the right-wing trade union bureaucracy and the International Labour Office in Geneva admits that the official government figures are completely false. I would say roughly unemployment has built up since the beginning of this long wave till today from around 10 million in the imperialist countries to around 50 million, and it continues to rise practically uninterruptedly. In the third world, of course, the figures are horrendous. They go in the hundreds of millions. And the third characteristic to which less attention is generally paid, not by Anwar and myself, but by many